It's time for the week in review, and you can tell this week is going to be a little bit different. I don't know what's giving that away. What? This is going to be fun. Everyone, this is my husband, Leif.
What's going on, everyone?
Leif, this is everyone.
How are you?
What we like to do during our week in review is kind of take a deep breath, a step back from the news, and look at the different themes that have surfaced. And what's interesting is that this week we're kind of ending up at the same point we were last week, asking some of the similar questions. So a lot of this is focused on Iran and the United States. So here's three things that I think are really important on that story if we take a look at the week overall. And by the way, a lot of this could change because this is a developing story just even as we're recording this. So we'll see basically what happens. But we're back in the Strait of Hormuz. We're back in the Middle East and with questions about what's happening in this very important waterway. We get the news this week that the United States is sending more troops defensively to the Middle East, and this is raising questions about rising tensions and the possibility of war. At the same time of all of this, we have the acting Secretary of Defense resigning. And what we're learning is that this is the longest period we've gone without a Secretary of Defense, and permanent Secretary of Defense, or I should say appointed Secretary of Defense in American history. So I thought to myself, it would be really great to talk to someone who's been to this particular waterway in this part of the world, who has seen combat and understands what it takes to go to war or not go to war, and can talk to us a little bit about leadership. And I didn't really have to look that far because this is my husband, Leif, and he can do all those things. So I'm not going to give him a huge bio, but you should know about Leif is he went to the Naval Academy. He spent time as a surface warfare officer, which means he sailed the world on some of our big Navy ships. He transferred, became a Navy SEAL, did multiple combat deployments as a Navy SEAL, left the Navy, has written 2 best-selling books on leadership. So you see, it really works out great. And he can't tell me no, which is also great when you request an interview.
Everybody works for somebody.
So here we are. So I just thought it would be really useful to have perspective from someone like Leif when you're seeing these news items flash across your phone or your screen. So I'm going to take that in 3 parts. Do you remember the first time that you sailed through the Strait of Hormuz?
Definitely.
What was that like?
It was fascinating. I mean, it's definitely it's a narrow waterway, and you've got the Omanis on one side. You know, their naval vessels come out and query you, and you got the Iranians on the other side, who are always threatening and always trying to provoke you in some way. So everyone's generally. There's watchstanders are there. If the ship's not general quarters, I mean, everyone's actually at their watch stations. I don't remember being at general quarters, but you definitely are manning, gun positions, and people are actually at the ready for sure.
And that's even just during quote unquote normal times.
Yeah, that's normal times.
So when you say that Iranians are always like a little threatening, what do you mean by that?
Well, they always want to just push the envelope of that this is their. They always try to establish their territorial water. So there's a difference between what we recognize as international waters versus territorial waters, and then there's something we call Iranian claimed territorial waters, which is they say, hey, this is our territorial waters, and the rest of the world doesn't recognize that, but they always actually try to push that way further out. But to your question, the first time that I met my ship, so I graduated from the Naval Academy. I went to about a 6-month school, and then I went to San Diego, and I was there for just only a couple of weeks, and then they flew me out I flew into Bahrain, and then I took a helicopter down to Oman, and then they flew me out to the ship where I met the ship. And it was interesting flying. I basically flew over the Straits of Hormuz in a helicopter, and it's fascinating to see the amount of shipping traffic coming through there. It's unbelievable. I mean, you could just, as far as you can see, there's tankers lined up coming in and out of the Persian Gulf. It's really fascinating.
And just on that, we talked about it being narrow because it's 20 miles across the Strait of Hormuz. So that's the waterway that gets to the Persian Gulf where these tankers can pick up oil. But you can really only sail through a small portion of that 20 miles.
It's pretty narrow. When you talk about the amount of shipping traffic that was coming in and out of the Persian Gulf and still continues to, it's an incredibly busy waterway. it's that's why we call it a choke point. It's a narrow waterway, and if a country controls that narrow waterway, then you control access to the Persian Gulf, all the oil reserves. That's why we always have a major presence there, because Iran is always threatening to shut it down. Really has been since 1979.
So you mentioned something really important, and I failed to mention this at the top of our conversation, but the big news has been that there was a drone, a United States, I know you don't like the word drone, which you can tell us about, an unmanned
We just call it
aerial
a UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, or now the term unmanned aerial system, or UAS.
So one of our drones was shot down by the Iranians, and the Iranians say, you guys were over our airspace. And the United States said, no, we weren't. We're over the Strait of Hormuz. And you just said that even in the waterway, the Iranians claim part of that waterway that internationally is not recognized necessarily as their own, is that we would recognize as an international waterway space. Is that right? I guess what I'm asking is it possible that we're talking about the same space in the air, that the Iranians say that was our airspace, and the United States says, no, it wasn't. That was international airspace.
It's highly probable, actually, because that's the way the Iranians, what happens is we generally recognize 12 miles off the coast as territorial waters. So if you're within 12 miles of the coast of the United States, that's American territorial waters. What they do is try to draw these straight lines between points of land in the Persian Gulf that gives them much greater distance than that. So then they claim that as their territorial waters, which is why we'll usually push ships in there to just establish that, hey, this is actually not Iranian territorial waters. This is an international waterway, and that's usually where conflict comes about. So we call it Iranian claimed territorial waters. I'm sure it's exactly the same thing, and I don't have any inside information over this incident this supposed global hawk that was shot down here, which is a very large UAV or drone, as you say. But that's probably very much in all likelihood what happened is that we were actually flying in over international airspace, and Iran is saying, no, that's ours. I mean, you can't trust anything that comes from the Iranian news agencies or their government. They're always going to twist it to their own means, and they're trying to push propaganda. So you can't really make judgments based on what they're saying.
Could they say the same about us?
Well, they do say the same about us all the time, but it's they're pretty adamant about calling us the Great Satan and calling for the destruction of America. And if you look at the constant propaganda that comes out from them, it's pictures of sunken U.S. ships and their dominance over the Persian Gulf and the region. I think that's kind of their aim.
So, what do you think about this talk that sort of bubbled up with the questions about are we nearing a full-fledged conflict where these tensions, where the Iranians have bombed the oil tankers, now they've taken out one of our drones, where this suddenly doesn't just become what it is, which is rising tensions, and actually becomes a full-fledged conflict. What would that actually take? And are we asking the right questions about whether or not that could take place?
I don't think it takes much to ignite into an international conflict. I mean, into a really significant, large-scale war. I think we've been on the verge of that for many years now. I'm actually surprised that hasn't happened to this date. I think
just because of the tensions between the two countries and what could be miscalculation.
Yeah, not only the tensions between the two countries, but I think they really have an aim to dominate the entire region. They really, I think they really have that aim, and there's kind of there's a very religious element to the most of the of Muslims in the world subscribe to the Sunni branch of Islam. They're Shiite and or Shia, and I think they really want to put Shia Islam back into prominence, and that's kind of their dream and goal. So I think they really have a mind to want to export the revolution of 1979 that they think. And if you go back to the history of America, I don't think we've ever really kept them in check at all. I mean, they've been able to get away with a lot of things that we've allowed them to get away with, and I think that to me is really dangerous.
Can you give us an example of one?
Well, I mean, everything from they held U.S. embassy employees and State Department and military members hostage for 444 days. From the 1979 hostage crisis, and since that time, I mean, they've been involved in attacks on the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, in the 80s. It killed 241 Marines. There was another, I think, nearly 100 people killed in the U.S. Embassy bombing. There's quite concrete evidence that they were involved in that as well. I mean, there's no question that they inflicted a lot of damage on U.S. troops in the Iraq War as well, with something called EFPs, which is an explosively formed projectile, which is something that takes significant machinery to be able to manufacture, and those were coming out of Iran and being exported to Iraq, and the Shiite militias there, like Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army, and others like that really became proxy forces for Iran. So we've allowed them to get away with a lot of things, and it's I think, unfortunately, that puts us in a more dangerous situation, because other countries that may think, hey, we probably don't want to mess the United States, are going to keep us in check. I think they've been shown over and over again that we're going to back down, and we're not going to mess with them. And look, I mean, you just look at it on the map, they're about 3 or 4 times the size of Iraq. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're definitely, it's a large country. They've got significant military power. So there's no question. I don't think anybody wants to go to war with Iran if we can help that. But I definitely think that we need to show them that we're not going to allow them to get away with that bad behavior. We wrote in our leadership book, Extreme Ownership, it's not what you preach, what you tolerate. And I think that absolutely applies to foreign policy as well. So if you're going to let them blow up oil tankers and really intimidate their neighbors in the Persian Gulf region, and try to thumb their noses at us, then we can't allow them to get away with it. We have to show them that we're not going to be trifled with, and we're going to push back. And I think that is, to me, is something that will prevent a major war from Iran, if they recognize, like, hey, we're not going to be able to get away with that. Let's don't mess with the United States.
So I have about 1 million questions on all of that, but I'm gonna switch quickly to the leadership topic just for time. What do you think is the impact of not having a confirmed Secretary of Defense during this time, where there is a question about the direction for the U.S. military and leadership overall when it comes to America on the global stage? Do you think that has a real impact? Do you think an acting Secretary of Defense can do an adequate job? Like, what, as someone that's served, like, what kind of impact would that have on troops?
I think that acting Secretary certainly could have do an adequate job, and I think our Department of Defense is a huge organization. There's a lot of great people, in those roles that can make sure things function. I do think there's a significant impact in not having a Secretary of Defense, a sitting Secretary of Defense. I think that we would have less problems with Iran if we still had General James Mattis as our Secretary of Defense, and it's a shame that he's not still in that position. I think having someone who is very strong and is seen as not someone to be trifled with, the Iranians are going to respond to perceived weaknesses and do what they can. I mean, in the same way that any despotic regime out there is going to do those things. They're going to push the envelope as far as they can and see what they can get away with. So I think that there's no question that we're squeezing them, pretty significantly with economic sanctions right now, and that has impact. But I think that we need to get someone in that role. And I think it actually does impact the Department of Defense. You need a leader that you can actually recognize, okay, who's actually in charge, who's running this. And that's just, the Department of Defense is just such a gigantic organization. You definitely need someone in that role. And I think it's very important to the world to show them that we've got our ducks in a row, and our Department of Defense is strong, and there isn't any kind of leadership issue there that could even be a question.
It's interesting to think about that timing of it all, because the reason why some believe this has really bubbled up is because of the economic sanctions on Iran, and because Iran feels that pressure economically, publicly, but also for those in power. They're looking for ways to try to negotiate a relaxing of these sanctions so their economy can be better than it is, in simple terms. And so that's one of the things that also happened this week, is that the Iranians said to the Europeans, listen, we're going to be back on the path to pursue nuclear weapons unless you basically help us sidestep these sanctions from America that are really putting pressure on our economy. And America put that pressure because of Iran's status as a state sponsor of terror, and because of the mischief that America accuses Iran of around the world, not only right in their own country, but exporting it in a way that is dangerous, America thinks, to our interests. So it's a puzzle. Any final thoughts?
I thought it was interesting that this is the longest we've gone in history without having a Secretary of Defense or a Secretary of War, which I actually thought was a way cooler name back in the day. Secretary of War just sounds better than Secretary of Defense.
We should bring it back.
But
would you want that job?
It's a tough job. I think it's a tough job. I don't know that I'm qualified for that job, but I definitely think that we've got to have someone good in that position who knows what they're doing, and someone who's going to be able to rebuild our ability to deter our enemies, and I think that's something that is super important, so that we don't have to go out and fight wars. We don't have to go fight wars and spill the blood of American servicemen and women overseas in these kind of conflicts. We want to actually be able to deter our enemies so that they back down and don't actually make war on their neighbors or take aggressive action against us or others in the world. That they're worried about what we're going to do about it. And that's what we need.
And that's something you talk about in your book. Effective leadership, even though it can be a harder path in the immediate, allows for easier work in the long term. And I use easy in that if you are an effective leader, then you don't have to go out and do some of the hard work that needs to be done if there's not a clear mission. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think good leaders are looking out for the long-term strategic good of their team. I mean, you're talking about a campaign, not a single engagement, and that's the troubling thing about, I think, the U.S. political system, or really the political system in many parts of the world too, where if you're focused on the immediate, the election or that sort of thing, rather than hey, what about 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years down the road? What's going to be the best thing for our nation, for the world, for for freedom-loving peoples, anywhere.
I can't help but think about it that, and I think about this with Iran a lot. I would love to go to Iran someday. What a fascinating history the country has, and I'm sure there's a woman my age with toddlers running around having the same questions that I do, just about the future of the country and what's going to happen. And are her kids going to be dealing with the same problems that she's seen in her life? And I really wonder, if that'll be the case for our kids, if they'll be confronting these same questions, when they're our age, old.
Well, look, the reality is,
old, and tired.
I think evil is alive and well in the world. I think there's some great people the Iranian people are not our enemies, and I think that's something we need to make clear. And I think the United States has done a great job. Secretary Pompeo has made plenty of statements about that, and recently that I think are very strong. And we're like, the Iranian people are not our enemies. It's the regime that really holds them in bondage. Instead of taking care of their people, they've exported terrorism around the world, kind of focused on those sort of things that are really not in the best interest of their people long term. I would love it if they're one day liberated from that regime, and I think that could happen.
All right, this was sort of an impromptu week in review. I think it went well. Next time we'll be better prepared with microphones. You can hear us a little bit better. Our kids are upstairs watching something on television. We'll do a parenting week in review at some point. That has some interesting leadership questions. What's tougher, foreign policy or dealing with our 3-year-old at this point? Maybe our 3-year-old.
It's a toss-up, for sure.
We haven't written the leadership parenting book yet. Maybe that'll be next. I don't know.
Listen, thank you for having me. I hate to crash the party, but I will say this: that so much of the news, I get really busy these days. I love the news, and I just don't have a chance to watch a lot of news. So I appreciate the weekend updates, and I appreciate the smarter news. Jenna she does the hard work for me.
Even when it's late at night, and you're like, "Why are you waking me up when I'm turning all the lights on in the bedroom because I'm working until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning to get the site ready."
But you're doing the hard work for me, analyzing all the different stories and all the different news sources, and actually putting out what really matters. So I appreciate that.
All right, thanks, babe. Thanks for joining us. All right, guys, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week on Smarter News.